Good morning, beautiful people. It is great to be with you today. I hope that you're all doing well. Just a reminder that next Sunday during class time we'll begin our Christian Basics class. Well, we've talked about it just a little bit, that part of our emphasis this year is to share Jesus. And so if there's been somebody on your mind who you've been saying, man, I've been wanting to invite them, I've been looking for the perfect time to invite them to church, Sunday would be the perfect time. We're going to be talking in terms of Christian Basics, go about 7 weeks, but that'll start next week during class time. If you got your Bibles, go ahead and turn with me to Mark chapter 6. And I'm curious, how many Bibles do we have? How many Bibles are there? What a great sight. Mark chapter 6. We're going to begin in verse 30. I don't know why I said verse 30. We're not going to be in verse 30. We're going to be in verse 45. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side of Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. I want you to picture the scene with me. The disciples, many of whom are fishermen, that is their job, that is where they've spent their life out on the sea. They've seen storms before. Fishermen are in a boat, and they have been working hard all night long. The fourth watch of the night is somewhere around 3 to 6 a.m. So they have been rowing all night long and have yet to make it across the sea. In the midst of this great storm, this great gale that they can't seem to make any headway in, they spot a figure out on the waves. If you were in their position, and you spot a figure out on the waves in your sleep-deprived, delirious state, having rowed all night long, what conclusion would you come to? For the figure is on the water. Not in the water, but on the water. What would you think? And they arrive at the conclusion that it must be a ghost, and they cry out. I don't know what they cried. I'm not sure if it was help me. I'm not sure if it was I'm not sure what they cried. But they cried out, and then they got a response. And I wonder what that response sounded like. Don't be afraid. Now, you and I know it's Jesus. But they just heard from a figure out on the water walking in their sleep-delirious, sleep-deprived state. Something talked back to them in the midst of this great gale, don't be afraid. The irony of that statement, I think, is hilarious. And then Jesus gets in the boat and everything gets calm. And if they weren't afraid before, they were afraid then. This particular miracle, this particular episode, emphasizes the power and deity that Jesus had. Emphasizes the power and the might that he had. And it builds off some Old Testament texts, specifically about God. I want you to read them with me. The first is Job chapter 9. Who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea, who made the Bear and Orion, the Pleiades and the chambers of the south, who does great things beyond searching out, and marvelous things beyond number. Behold, he passes by me, and I see him not. He moves on, but I do not perceive him. Notice this is about God, who alone stretched out the heavens, who trampled the waves of the sea. In the Old Testament, God is the one who walks on the water. He is the one who tramples the sea. And it's not the only text that we get that from. Psalm 77. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. Again, that it is God who walks on the water, that God is known and seen by walking on the water. And one last one, read it with me. You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. That throughout the Old Testament, God is understood. God is the one who walks on the water. God is the one who tramples on the sea. And what Mark is exclaiming, screaming with his text is that this is God, for God is walking on the water. But there's one thing about Job I want us to look at a little bit more carefully. Notice again this text, who alone stretched out the heavens, who trampled the waves of the sea, who made the Bear and the Orion, the Pleiades and the chambers of the south, who does great things beyond searching out and marvelous things beyond number. And notice this part. Behold, he passes by me, and I see him not. He moves on, but I do not perceive him. Now compare that with what we just read in Mark. In verse 48, and he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him. In the Old Testament, it is God who walks on the sea, but unseen. It is the God who tramples the water, but he is unseen, unperceived. And yet here, not just one, but all the disciples in the boat not only see Jesus, they see Jesus. Not only do they see him walking in the water, but they are able to perceive him, and they all see him, despite the fact that Job expresses that God is the one who walks on the water, yet we don't see him. What Mark seems to be emphasizing, not only that Jesus is deity, but he is deity that was able to be seen, for he reveals God. Not only is he God, but God is revealed through him, for they were able to see him and perceive him. Now notice what Jesus is going to do. He meant to pass them by. Now earlier, in verse 48, and he saw that they were making headway painfully. Jesus saw, most likely from a mountaintop where he'd been praying. Because remember, he went to a mountaintop to pray, sends the disciples off as praying on the mountain so he can see them. They've been making headway painfully. He walks on the water and he intends to pass them by. Why? He could see they were struggling. He could see they were having a hard time. So why did he intend to pass them by? Seems almost a little bit heartless. Unless perhaps he wanted them to see him change course, to see the impact that their cries had upon him. Lily was, 5 weeks, 6 weeks old, something like that. She's pretty young, and when Lily was really young in her bassinet, she had a favorite place to sleep. It was in the midst of the hustle and bustle. She would prefer to sleep around all the noise than be back in her crib, in her room by herself. I guess she just wanted to be a part of everything. And I remember on one particular day, we were getting breakfast ready. We were moving around the kitchen. It was quite noisy because I have 2 boys, in case you didn't know. And they tend to be quite rambunctious. They're making quite a bit of noise this particular morning. And all of a sudden, Aurora stopped, turned around, and rushed to the crib. Apparently, sometimes what happens in preemies, for Lily was born early, sometimes what happens in preemies is they'll get a little bit of something stuck in their throat, and then they don't know what to do with it. And they just stop. They don't breathe, they don't swallow, they just go, because they're not sure what to do with it yet. They haven't learned. Well, somewhere in the midst of all of that, Aurora's ear picked up on that, and rushed over there to grab Lily and pull her up, and then all the stuff that comes afterwards. She's fine. But something about that mother's ear, for the ear of their parent, for an ear of a parent, when they hear their child, they'll drop everything and rush and change everything that they're doing because their child has cried out. God here is revealing himself through Jesus. Jesus intends to walk by his disciples. And I suspect the reason for that is so that they would see him shift course whenever they cried out. To emphasize his compassion and his care that yes, God has plans, and yes, God is going places, but God also is impacted by the cries of those he loves. God is impacted by the cries of his children, and might even change course because of them. Notice verse 52. For they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. The first lesson we learn from Mark chapter 6 is that God sees our struggles. But then there's a second one. What Mark does here in Mark chapter 6 is he links Jesus walking on the water with the feeding of the 5,000 previously. He expresses that he intends for them to be read together, for he says they didn't understand the lesson of the loaves. So to understand all that is taking place on walking on the water, we also have to read the lesson of the 5,000, or the feeding of the 5,000. It's Mark 6, beginning in verse 30. The apostle returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them. And they ran there on foot from the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like a sheep without a shepherd. He began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." And he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So sit down in groups of hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the apostles. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Anytime the Bible begins to repeat itself, anytime you see a word or a phrase or an idea repeated, it's usually important. By my count, there are 3 times where this particular location of the feeding of the 5,000 is described. 3 times where it's described as a desolate place. The Bible doesn't usually repeat details unless they're important. 3 times suggests that it's an important point, that it is the desolate place in which Jesus feeds these individuals. I wonder if perhaps he's drawing upon another point in time. Can you think of any point in time in the Old Testament where a group of people were fed in a desolate place? You might remember in Exodus where the children of Israel are moving towards the promised land. And there in the wilderness, they cry out for food, and God sends them manna from heaven and feeds them. And in fact, throughout that entire journey, until they get to the promised land, they'll be fed with manna and at times quail, because God feeds his people in the desert. Remember, the 2 episodes are linked. Walking on the water and the feeding of the 5,000. And Mark is emphasizing that Jesus is deity incarnate, that he is God. In one case, it's that God walks on the water and is being revealed by Jesus. And here, in this instance, in the feeding of the 5,000, that God provides, even in the wilderness. For just as God would lead Israel from the wilderness to the promised land, so Jesus was in the process of coming to rescue mankind, to offer all mankind the opportunity for salvation, and then lead them through the wilderness of life to the promised land. That is, to lead them towards heaven. That God provides even in the wilderness. I want you to notice something. In verse 45, immediately he, that's Jesus, made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. Why did the disciples go into the boat? Because Jesus made them. Jesus knew a storm was coming, but he made them. Why was a group of people in the wilderness? Why was a group of 5,000 people there in the wilderness for Jesus to be able to feed? Because he made them stay there. His disciples even come and ask him, "Hey, it's really time to send these people away because they're going to be hungry. They need to be able to get somewhere before they all faint from starvation. Please, let's send them away now." And Jesus says, "No, we can take care of it." Why were they in the wilderness? Because Jesus left them there, or Jesus had them stay there. Why were the disciples in the boat? Why did they encounter a storm? Because Jesus made them get into a boat. Why would Jesus send people out into a storm? Why would he have them sit in the midst of a wilderness? It seems throughout the Old Testament that God often reveals himself in the midst of the wilderness, in the midst of the challenges. Consider, for example, Psalm 23, which most of us are probably familiar with. You might remember, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. And then we encounter this at verse 5. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Now, a table could have been prepared at any particular place. God could have decided to make a table and lavish David wherever he wanted to. But he chooses to do it in the presence of my enemies. Notice the picture as though the enemies were gathered all around, and God has set this table before David, a table that could have been set at any other point in time, but here it is set in the midst even of enemies. That it seems that God often reveals himself in the midst of difficulty. Often reveals himself most in the midst of the challenges of life, in the midst of the wildernesses of life. And if we went around this room, I suspect all of us could talk in terms of times where we've been forced to rely upon God more. And I would be willing to wager that the majority of those times would be difficult times. Yes, there would be times whenever we would say, I was so thankful for what God did, and I praised him for what he did. But the times when you had to rely upon him, when you learned the most about him, I would be willing to bet was probably in the midst of the challenges and difficulties of life. I don't know if that's just because that's when God reveals himself more, or if that's because that is when we are most willing and ready to see him. Either way, it seems that we learn the most about who God is in the midst of the difficulties and challenges associated with life, which is exactly what we see in the case of the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on the water. That Jesus is proclaiming himself to be God incarnate, but not just God incarnate, a God incarnate that everyone could see, that he would reveal God, and reveal God to be compassionate, reveal God to be faithful, reveal God to care about his people. As the disciples were facing that storm, where was Jesus? As the crowd sat with their bellies hungry, where was Jesus? One of the questions that sometimes gets asked in the midst of difficulties was, well, where did God go? Even the prophets in the Old Testament kind of ask the same question. Jeremiah would say, God, you're like an unreliable spring. I go to drink and you're not there. Where did you go in the midst of these difficulties? But notice where he is in the midst of the storm. Notice where he was in the midst of the hunger that was there in the wilderness. That he was right there with them. He was right there in the midst of those challenges. And God through Jesus reveals his compassion that he's always been amongst mankind, wanting mankind to look for him. And he also reveals that of his care and his compassion towards his people, that he is right in the midst of the challenges that we face, whatever they might be, whether they are storms, whether they are wilderness, wherever we find ourselves. That he hasn't abandoned us, but is right in the middle of it with us. And then we discover that he provides. For there in the midst of the storm, he will take care of his disciples. And there, as he feeds 5,000, he will provide for the people there. That even in the midst of those difficult times of life, in the midst of the storms, in the midst of the wilderness, that God always remains faithful by providing what we need. We're told in Romans chapter 8 that God works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. The text does not say that all things are good. There are some things that are just inherently evil. It does say that God works all things together for good. Not good according to my definition, but according to his definition. Works all things together for the good of those who love him and called according to his purpose. What I understand the text to be saying is that there's a good God who is always at work for the good of his people. And so when we find ourselves in the midst of the difficulties of life, find ourselves in the midst of the wilderness, in the midst of the storm, we're reminded that God has not abandoned us, that he's not left us, that he remains there with us, and that he is at work for the good of his people, a good God who is always at work. There's a popular song going around right now. I'm thankful for the scars. I think it conveys an eternal truth that we see throughout the Bible and even see here in the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on the waters. That if we didn't have the scars of the challenges, then we wouldn't know the depths of his love. Doesn't mean the challenges are fun. Doesn't mean they're enjoyable. Doesn't mean we have to like them. It does mean that God chooses to redeem the difficult times and uses those to fully reveal himself as teach us something about who he is, his compassion, his faithfulness, his love. Perhaps you're here today and you want to begin a relationship with the one who loves you most, the one who sacrificed everything that you might have a relationship with him that starts at baptism. And there's nothing that would excite us more than to help you begin that journey today. But perhaps you're here today and you just need the prayers of the church. If there's any way we can assist you, won't you come as together we stand and sing.